As America begins to gain momentum as an independent nation in the 19th century, they push away from European countries, isolating themselves from the Old World. President James Monroe proposed the Monroe Doctrine in 1823, a foreign policy stating that any European interference with North or South America would be seen as an act of aggression and would result in U.S. intervention. This policy kept Europe uninvolved in American affairs in the Caribbean as the U.S. took part in the Spanish-American War. The doctrine separated Europe from the Americas, leading the U.S. towards isolation from European powers. As the 1930s approached, the scars of World War I and the fresh wounds of the Great Depression kept American politics and the public leaning towards isolation. The U.S. turned down the opportunity to join the League of Nations, further distancing themselves from worldly affairs. Another foreign policy was passed, the Stimson Doctrine, which prevented the recognition of territorial changes between two nations that initiated with military aggression. This kept the U.S. out of Asian affairs during 1931 as Japan began its occupation of the province of Manchuria, located in northern China. World War begins to break out in Europe in 1939, and as Japan continues their invasion through Indochina, the U.S. avoids direct military action, but bans oil and other important exports toward their country. Tension stiffens between the United States and the Empire of Japan, culminating with the Empire's bombing of the U.S. naval base on Pearl Harbor, December 7th of 1941, the first ever attack on American soil.
That since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
Isoroku Yamamoto changed the future role of the United States through the bombing of Pearl Harbor, which compelled the U.S. to become the worldwide police force modern America is today. After World War II, the U.S. began to become more aware of global affairs in hopes of preventing events like Pearl Harbor. His legacy is left with America's expansion into the world as a global watchdog. Pearl Harbor catalyzed the U.S. into becoming a worldwide power player. About 100 years before the attack on Pearl Harbor, Commodore Matthew C. Perry of the United States Navy sailed to Japan in search of a new trade relationship. Until this point, Japan had been isolated from foreign influence for more than 200 years under the orders of the Sakoku policy, implemented by the Tokugawa shogunate. But as more and more Western powers began to open relations with the Japanese in the 1800s, the empire was pushed to build their navy in hopes of remaining competitive. By 1897, the Japanese were ordering warships at a faster pace than any nation across the globe, Britain being the only exception. Soon, the Japanese Navy was 76 warships strong, matching the size of many Western powers. As the Japanese Navy grew increasingly large, Japan began to push the youth towards naval military careers. Isoroku Yamamoto graduated Japanese Naval College in 1904, and only a short year later saw action on the Nissen. Later, he pursued education in the U.S. at Harvard University and became a naval attaché for the Japanese embassy in Washington, D.C. During his studies and service, Yamamoto became increasingly aware of the industrial might and naval dominance of the United States. When Yamamoto was appointed admiral of Japan's combined fleet in 1939, he showed concern towards aggression against the United States. Yamamoto knew the U.S.'s industrial and military advantages set them apart as a superpower in the West. As World War II took shape in Europe following Yamamoto's promotion, the Empire of Japan considered direct assault on the United States. Yamamoto began crafting a plan to allow the Japanese the upper hand in the Pacific Rim. He set his eyes on the naval base of Pearl Harbor, located off the Hawaiian island of Oahu. The only way the attack on Pearl Harbor could be made successful was through the use of aerial torpedoes. The imposing issue was Pearl Harbor's depth, which was only 45 feet and thought to be too shallow for the effective use of these underwater missiles. Meanwhile, during November of 1940, the Royal Navy attacked the Italian fleet anchored in Taranto and sank 3 of their battleships using aerial torpedoes. Yamamoto studied the attack reports and noticed the depth of Taranto was only 42 feet. The use of Britain's modified torpedoes allowed for effective bombing in shallow waters. If Yamamoto was able to replicate these torpedoes, the bombing of Pearl Harbor could become a reality. At the same time, the United States Navy also recognized the attack on Taranto. Taking notice of the same details as Yamamoto, they began to fear vulnerability for Pearl Harbor to a Japanese attack. A memorandum was sent to Army Secretary Henry Stimson from Navy Secretary Frank Knox, warning of impending danger. The success of the British aerial torpedo attack against ships at anchor suggests that precautionary measures be taken immediately to protect Pearl Harbor against a surprise attack in the event of war between the United States and Japan. The greatest danger will come from aerial torpedo. The highest priority must be given to getting more interceptor planes, AA guns, and additional radar equipment. Although the United States recognized the attack, no action or preparation was taken to prevent the incoming danger, leaving the U.S. vulnerable to the Japanese. Yamamoto is coined for the creation of the Pearl Harbor attack, but originally opposed the Empire of Japan involving themselves in World War II. Yamamoto remained true to his anti-war stance by discouraging the alliance with Germany and Italy through the Tripartite Pact of 1941, which would go on to formulate the Axis powers. He also disputed the idea of war with the Americans as tensions grew between the Empire and the U.S. Yamamoto knew that the United States industrial might would be able to craft battleships, aircraft carriers, and other naval vessels faster than Japan could gain advantage over them. If Japan was going to emerge victorious, Yamamoto proposed that they must defeat the United States within a year. If not, the industrial power of the U.S. would catch up to them. If I am told to fight, I shall run wild for the first 6 months, but I have utterly no confidence for the second or third year. The bombing of Pearl Harbor also had to be a complete success. It had to eliminate the entire fleet stationed there. Otherwise, Japan would never be able to gain the upper hand in the Pacific Rim, if the United States Navy was fully operational. Although he made his doubts of victory clear throughout the Japanese Empire, he carried out his plans for Pearl Harbor due to his patriotic loyalty towards the Emperor. The bombing of Pearl Harbor was viewed successful in the eyes of Japan, but Yamamoto knew they had failed to cripple the U.S. fleet to the extent they needed for victory. Although the Japanese bombing had immobilized 18 U.S. battleships, they had left oil depots, submarine docks, and shipyards untouched. There was another error. No aircraft carriers had been sunk or even damaged during the bombing. Yamamoto's passion was aviation, and knew air superiority would be an important factor in the Pacific theater. These aircraft carriers proved dominant in the Pacific Rim as the U.S. Air Force became crucial to winning the war effort. Japan had failed to deal considerable damage to the U.S. Navy through the Pearl Harbor bombing, and the war between the two nations lasted nearly 4 years. A combination of Yamamoto's failure in the execution of Pearl Harbor and convincing the Empire against the war with the U.S. ultimately led to their defeat. Yamamoto died shortly after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, although his plan unintentionally compelled the U.S. to become more involved in global conflicts. By the end of 1945, the United States would go on to join the United Nations, an international organization that linked the U.S. to the rest of the world and its affairs. After Yamamoto's attack, the United States began recognizing threats like communism during the Cold War and acted on them. Soon, the U.S. would involve itself globally in large affairs with a military presence in Vietnam and Korea. Eventually, they would lead troops into the Middle East during the Persian Gulf War and the ongoing War on Terror. The significance of the Pearl Harbor attack on world history is huge. It triggered political culture in the U.S. to become more aware of ongoing conflicts across the globe. Yamamoto's handiwork pushed the United States into World War II. The influence of the war changed the U.S. standpoint on political affairs from non-intervention to becoming an international police force. Yamamoto unintentionally kick-started the United States into a global superpower and compelled them towards becoming a worldwide watchdog.